rarely ever better after they get done with it. And it's like this whole mess. Anyway, hello and welcome back to this episode of Ride and Rant. I am your host once again, and I'd like to start off by saying, this is actually my first time ever being on this road. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Arbeit Macht Frei. Now, if that doesn't sound familiar to you, then it shouldn't, because it's actually a German phrase. This phrase was one of the very first things many of the Holocaust survivors and victims saw as they got off the train and entered what was quite possibly the last few days or weeks of their life inside of any of over 40,000 camps across Poland and Germany during World War II. The phrase, translated, "work makes one free," was on the iron fence that served as the main entrance that all occupants of the Nazi concentration and work camps read as they entered in, but could be interpreted in two different ways, one much darker than the other. Most notably of these camps was Auschwitz-Birkenau. This was actually the largest concentration camp, as depicted in the documentary Schindler's List. This camp was not only a work camp, but also a death camp. Those who were sent to this camp were most certainly exterminated, executed, but not before being humiliated, starved, and worked to the point that they were literally nothing more than a skeleton. So what did that mean to the unfortunate temporary residents of such an evil place? First, as a more political slogan, it could have simply meant that working and slaving for the Nazis would have a redemptive or freeing value. Or, the second most likely option, given their plans, was more to mask the brutality and genocide and slavery and essentially say it without saying it, that working will give you freedom only through your death. The Nazis were really masterful in their propaganda and messaging. The Nazis were not just a group of methodical murderers. They prided themselves on the message, the propaganda they used through their entire reign, from turning one sect against another to eventually convincing all those they imprisoned that there was indeed hope. They took pleasure in psychological torture almost as much as the Japanese did with their Unit 731, but the Germans were not entirely about experimenting on their prisoners to that extent, though it wasn't absent from their toolbox of torture and control. We can just see the example of that through Joseph Mengele. They just preferred to psychologically torture as opposed to physically. They also prided themselves on their corporatization of the Nazi brand. Hitler was very involved in the overall commercial image of the Nazi Party, from the swastikas to the uniforms designed by Hugo Boss, because every corporation has to have an approved uniform. Of course, like most corporate business, always looking for an edge. Boss actually became a member of the Nazi Party 2 years after Hitler took power. And of course, this gave him a tremendous boost to his brand of being the official clothing source for the entire Nazi Party in all of their military branches. You know, Nazis, really, in their methodology, are not much different than many corporations or political parties of today, with their branded colors, their clever and destructive marketing campaigns, their characterization of certain groups in a specific light, their false impression of being accepting of adverse, diverse, or otherwise controversial ideals, while at the same time using those same tactics as a way to root out those in opposition to their overall goals, making them easier to destroy. You know, I find the comparison between the slogan the Nazis used in their attempts to reduce the population, of whom they deemed useless, and those that we find used by corporations, not just in the present, but also in the past decades, to be incredibly more subtle in its phrasing, yet still carry with it a similar outcome. You know, we've all heard a lot of these phrases before. You know, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Of course, if you think about it, this actually romanticizes work to the point of denying its toll. used to justify underpaying creatives and passion-driven labor as though part of their compensation should come from the love they have of working in an office and sitting in useless meetings so that the CEOs can increase their stock prices and therefore expand their wealth. Or how about, we're all family here? This is really nothing more than weaponized intimacy. It discourages boundaries. It makes dissent feel like betrayal to a family member like your mother or your father. It's very common in retail, food service, and a lot of startups, but also heard in many larger corporations. A favorite of hiring managers. And of course, we've all heard, work hard, play hard. Some people have even used that in jingles and commercials. This reinforces extreme performance culture while pretending at the same time that it is balanced. This is used very heavily in tech and sales industries because if you're salaried, they can expect to work from you anytime, day or night. Now, of course, they would say, well, we don't want you to work outside of regular business hours, but just so that you know, there is this 8-hour project that we need by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Another one, own it. Be all in. This pushes personal responsibility for systemic issues that you really have no control over. But if you fail, you're the only one to be blamed. Translates to, if you burn out, it's your fault. Another one, freedom through discipline. Does that sound familiar? It sounds virtuous, but it can mask rigid productivity quotas or even surveillance that companies have over their employees. It echoes military and authoritarian overtones. Another one, we are all hands on deck. How many times have you heard this before? I cannot count how many times I heard this in the last job that I had. This one usually means forget your role, forget what you were hired to do and you're paid to do in the first place, and work nonstop for a crisis that we did not plan for and for an undetermined amount of time that we cannot tell you when it's going to end. This usually is typically until the new priority or new crisis arises. Then that last one is just, it's old news. It doesn't matter anymore. The list goes on and on. And there is the Dallas skyline. And that brings us to modern work and the retirement realities that everybody of the boomer generation is facing now. The only goal that anyone has when they're working anywhere is not a corner office anymore. It's not a fancy title. It's retirement, where all of your years of hard work makes one free. No more bosses, no more meetings, no more early mornings, late nights, last-minute calls, or just one more thing before you go. You're done and can enjoy the remainder of your life in peace, doing what you want, when you want, and no one can tell you otherwise. That was the dream that has slowly become a fairy tale and is now an impossibility for younger generations. Whenever I graduated college back in 2009, I remember the retirement age had just gone from 50 to 55. Now, over the last course of the 15 years, it has gone all the way up to 65 and 70 in some places. Even the news wants to make people believe that because medicine has gotten so much better over the years, and people are supposedly living longer, even though we just recently lost 3 well-known celebrities in the last month, ranging from their 50s to their 70s, it would seem as though they're simply full of it. Retirement has nothing to do with the advancements of medicine and science, and has everything to do with a workforce that is still required because the elites still have life left to squeeze out of them. There is no rest, there is no reward, there is no end, for the common man anyway. One of these such nations has already proposed raising their retirement age to 70. Denmark, in the last couple of months, has decided that 40 to 50, and for some 60, is still not enough time to have paid your penance to a society that only wishes to use you and to make their life more comfortable, whether through taxes, labor, or personal resources and belongings. Anymore it only takes one to be a proof of concept for other countries to follow the example, much like lemmings. Of course, these governments aren't ruled by politicians anymore. It hasn't been that way for a long time, but corporocrats who have figured out that they can circumvent elections and the governing process, policy debate, and go straight to enacting laws that benefit their own interests in their quest to accumulate and claim all resources possible. Is it even worth asking if retirement is real anymore? Or is it just a carrot on a stick that you'll never reach, but you'll get beaten with every single day? Work may set you free, but the current plan by those in power would be to see you free only in death. Free from taxes, free from work, free from consuming what they view as their valuable resources, because once again, you're nothing but a useless eater and a drain on the economy. Retirement anymore only serves to give those still working a false hope that one day they'll earn their freedom. Like they're a gladiator fighting for their life every day in a coliseum, just hoping that they not only survive, but that when they do, they'll be given their freedom and the rudis, the wooden sword, the symbol of freedom from servitude, given by the emperor himself. They essentially want all of us who work within the system to give our all for the system, but at the same time still believe in the hope that we'll finally be free from the system and finally be able to enjoy the life we were allowed to build one day. This is one of the most stark differences between older generations, such as the greatest generation, the silent generation, the boomers, Gen X to an extent, and the millennials and Gen Z. We have seen the decay and the degradation of this system, of risking everything versus a potential reward. It all began to fall apart, and Gen X and millennials were front and center to see the ground crack and fall into the retirement abyss below them. Millennials started out strong, believing that even if they couldn't have the life or the dream of the previous generations, they could still at least have a semblance of it. But now, as many Zennials or elder millennials are nearing 40, that hope is all but gone. And they've essentially gone into a self-preservation mode, while Gen Z has given up not only hope, but any desire to follow any rules to any game that society would have them play as new blood. We're still working toward freedom, but at what cost? And what kind of freedom will this actually bring? And what sacrifice will it require? Will the elites who essentially run these governments through their corporations get to a point where they refuse to let people opt out of playing this game of theirs, or create brand new laws to force everybody back into the system, showing its true colors? We saw a lot of that during COVID, where you had so many of these corporations that they either had to close up shop and risk nearing bankruptcy, or admit that they were wrong and actually let their employees work from home where they were happier, they were more productive, they were more free to do what they wanted during the day. And which did they choose to do? They chose the latter for their own self-preservation. And now they're going back to these RTO policies once again, trying to force people back in, and if those people don't go, then it's an automatic, you're done, you're out of here. It's almost as though we're going through another version of the feudal system once again. If you think about it, this really has not changed. It's only evolved in the way it's portrayed to become more acceptable and tolerable. I know there are some that would probably say, comparing Holocaust victims to, modern employees is a bit far-fetched. But I'm not just looking at the surface, but the deeper similarities between the two, the mentalities that are there in both, that affect people's lives, their livelihood, their happiness, their future, their quality of life. The disdain that most companies have towards their employees as a drain on their profits, and more favoritism towards shareholders, the party they are affiliated with. They think that a little $60 pizza party here and there and $5 donuts on Friday is supposed to be a replacement for actual value derived from the pay people receive that anymore is 200 times less than what most of these CEOs make, and politicians also. The fact that your work should be for the glory of the corporation, the glory of Rome, and the credit of your superiors, instead of being recognized for what you actually produce and being compensated as such. The oddity that if an employee gets too old or too expensive, they'll just get rid of them and move a lesser paid employee into their spot, which is a quiet promotion. You don't ask who did your job before you. Just be grateful. We are giving you the opportunity to show your loyalty and your temporary worth. As the middle class continues to erode further and further, removing that American dream from the average American's grasp, we're moving back to a two-class system similar to what they had in the Middle Ages, where you had the nobles and the serfs. The nobles were in good graces with the king and owned land, either conquered or inherited, and managed them by the grace of the king. And then you had the peasants, the working class, who worked the land of the nobles and also paid taxes to the nobles who collected those very same taxes. But in 1347, the Black Death, a newly received pandemic at the time that lasted 4 years, wiped out about 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, ironically, ended up leading to labor shortages, peasants demanding higher wages until the ruling class froze those wages. As England continued in their costly wars going on at the time, they raised taxes and added new taxes. Eventually, this led to the Peasants' Revolt. Currently, you see companies being sued for manipulating and inflating rent costs to maximize profits for these property management companies, and even the companies that provide their software. People are being forced to pay way more than what housing should ever be worth, especially apartment housing. Having worked in that industry before and having lived in apartments myself, they run and repair apartments based on the very bare minimum to meet their legal obligations. Cheap appliances, small water heaters, run-of-the-mill stoves and light fixtures. You're paying for what? It's not the name, it's not the location. They want you to believe that it is, but it is not. And the cost of rent just keeps going up and up and up, pricing out most people that could have afforded it 4, 5, 6 years ago. Used to, families could simply survive and even thrive based on a single income. However, since feminism came about, and I know that is a touchy subject, you now have both husband and wife that have to work. And in this current gig economy, as they are calling it, jobs, careers have been replaced by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 side hustles just to be able to compensate for what one single income used to cover. While everyone is door dashing and Ubering and Amazoning, the millionaire CEOs are retiring at 45 or earlier than that, unless you are of the more desperate demographic and you have an OnlyFans that makes you $67 million in 3 years and you're out. Then you really have to ask, what is the price that they will end up paying, unseen years from now, for that short-lived success? Don't forget, ladies, Uncle Sam still wants his taxes. He may not have been bent up like a pretzel, but he still wants his share of your earnings. Crash, keep right. Man, any other day of the week, and there would probably be like 4 or 5 of these things along here. wind up some of this since there's only one car there. Usually one vehicle just doesn't cut it in this area. But anyway, the beautiful thing about pushing anything, specifically people, to find their breaking point is that there is a definitive breaking point. And CEOs and politicians, because, let's face it, politicians are not the ones in power. They're puppets, every last one, controlled by those who pay them in donations and contributions, all tax deductible, of course. As younger generations are pushed closer and closer to the breaking point, they're refusing to play this game, the game that all prior generations played because there was some compensation or honor in destroying yourself for someone else's greed. And I love it when recruiters and HR talent acquisition staff get on sites like LinkedIn, not all, but most, and they just double and triple down on the same tropes that people have come to hate and despise about the corporate thinking that it's going to inspire the slaves to go out and pick more cotton. This actually began to take root when people started quiet quitting their jobs. And no, that doesn't mean they just stopped working without telling anyone. It simply means that people started doing the bare minimum based off of their skewed job titles and descriptions and what they were actually hired on and paid to do. Even the last place that I worked at, every year you have these annual employee evaluations. Used to, they would be taken seriously. But once managers say the quiet part out loud and you find out the promotions are already determined before reviews even happen, and C-level doesn't want anyone making above average scores or above 3 out of 5 on their review by managers, then you realize that they don't want people working there who might actually pose a threat to their job one day if they actually score high. Once again, the carrot and the stick. You know, it occurred to me several years ago when I left another design job I had. Employees really should approach any position that they have with a business or a company as nothing more than that company subscribing to that individual as a service provider. Someone who they can now cancel their use of anytime they want without warning or notice. That's how companies treat people anymore. So why should we negotiate salary rates and benefits of taking on that company as an employer subscriber as anything different? There's no loyalty. They're only as good as the money that they provide and nothing more. Once the money stops, so does your service. Personally, I feel that that's a very hypergamous attitude to take, but that's what this corporate world has become and has encouraged. It's gotten to the point currently where quiet quitting is not even enough, and people are opting out entirely. You know, they're tired of having to play the game, a game which you can never win, because just like casinos, it's rigged against you. The only wins you have are to entice you to keep playing. But even free arcade game rooms, the cereal bars, the sleep pods, and all these other gimmicks are not working anymore. You know, the previous generations, a lot of them call it lazy, but most current generations are actually waking up to the self-sacrificial performances that yield nothing except more work, as though exchanging your time for their pocket change is worth it. The late nights trying to catch up on work that will still be there in the morning. You know, you're made to feel that it's leading to a promotion or a raise, but when the company tells you, well, why should we give you a raise or a promotion for doing what you're expected to do? Then you see, or at least you should see, the gaslighting and delusional state of C-suite illogic that is causing so many people to revolt against the corporate status quo. But still, even with this blatantly put on display for all corporatocrats to see, they're still blinded to the failing method of operation that they could fool previous generations with, but not the younger ones, especially since the younger generations saw and got to be on the other end of their parents, grandparents' obligations to a job or boss that threatened job loss over more labor, more time, more life-giving to the company, the CEOs, the machine altogether. But what happens when that machine breaks? You know, just as the peasants rebelled and got the nobles' attention, we are seeing the same thing in our current history. Companies aren't hiring and replacing people with AI. People get fired and try to find another job. There are no human jobs. Things become more expensive. People begin to resent the corporate machine and kick them to the curb, and then the company CEOs start to panic because the peasants aren't buying our products anymore because we took away their income and their capability to purchase our product. Why don't these people want to work? The delusion is committable, as in white jacket padded room committable. Inevitably, in the type of economy that we have, if there is no spending, if there is no debt, these corporations flounder and fail. This is why credit scores and building credit is so complicated. You have to have enough debt or access to debt, such as a credit card limit, to show a bank that you can manage being in debt without being irresponsible and failing to pay back with interest. And if you can't, then you lose. Of course, now this is until Big Daddy Government swoops in and bails them out, like an irresponsible parent when their delinquent child gets in trouble and they have to bail them out. One thing about riding on days where it is overcast, it is much, much cooler. You don't feel the sun beating down on you. Of course, usually whenever it is sunny around here, it's typically accompanied by about a 50 to 60% humidity, which makes you feel like you're riding through an Amazon jungle. Once you have a society that has been betrayed by the very system that they were raised to serve, playing the game and playing by the rules with the expectation of some sort of payoff, you begin to distrust and it becomes every man for themselves. Government gets thrown in with the same corruption because honestly, they're encouraging this behavior through politician complacency, and people revolt against law enforcement. And when you have the people against the government, you have anarchy, and cities begin to crumble, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. What comes next? Oh, someone just attacked the U.S. We need to unite and fight this unnamed, faceless threat as one country. If you don't support going to war with someone over something, then you're not patriotic. You're un-American. Essentially, when bread and circuses don't work because people can't afford it, send them to war. It's worked before. You know, throughout history, we see those in power will do whatever is necessary to keep the delusion alive. There are so many posts on LinkedIn from recruiters, HR directors, CEOs, and talent acquisition officers that still place the blame on those trying to find jobs. Your resume wasn't formatted correctly for our system. You're not applying enough times. If we reject you once, twice, thrice, it doesn't mean we'll reject you the fourth time. You just aren't networking enough. You're not posting enough. We can't see you do more. This does not encourage, by the way, but insult those who have jumped through all the hoops and still the system is broken. You know, what is freedom really worth? Freedom from tyranny, freedom from slavery, freedom from life. What is the dollar amount? We're still sold on the idea of retirement, but retirement from what? To have retirement, you have to have income. To have income, you must have a job, and not just a job, but one that will afford more than what is the bare minimum to simply exist, as retirement and savings are made from disposable income. There is nothing to dispose anymore. It really makes you wonder what kind of rest from work future generations might actually have. The jobs might not be as labor intensive, though it's easier to tell whenever you're exhausted. But how can you tell when you're mentally exhausted, doing the same mind-numbing thing over and over again, only to be relieved of your job when they deem you to be too old, or you finally quit, as many have, because the company finally found your breaking point and you are burnt out. So many times we think that leadership is just incompetent, and they have no idea what it is that they're doing. And that is probably, in most cases, true. They just succeed through dumb luck and take credit for their ignorance. But what if now they're trying to accomplish something darker as we move toward a more transhuman society where they reject organic human beings and promote a programmable, genetically spliced from birth or childhood human being where they can simply strip away accreditation to an all-powerful creator and place themselves in the position like so many others before them of being God and Master, because that is seriously the narcissistic type of mentality that so many corporations, so many CEOs, so many politicians have acquired nowadays. But that's a rant for another ride.